She was cornered in a freezing hallway, blood blooming across her maid uniform, with a manager who had finally crossed the line. Her only hope wasn't the authorities, it was a direct line to Lee Tae-hoon, the most dangerous man in the Korean underworld. Zuri Coleman was a ghost in her own life, a young waitress who had mastered the art of being invisible to survive. But when a single, violent slap shattered her silence, she was forced to call in a debt of honor from a man who specializes in making people disappear. This isn't just a story of rescue, it's the transformation of a woman who stopped apologizing for existing and found the strength to stand beside a dragon. The golden light of the high-end lounge was usually enough to mask the underlying rot of the city, but on that rainy Tuesday 6 months ago, the atmosphere felt particularly thin. Zuri adjusted her apron, her feet aching after a 10-hour shift, when the heavy oak doors swung open. A group of men entered, their presence instantly sucking the oxygen out of the room. At the center was Lee Tae-hoon. Even then, before she knew the weight of his name, Zuri could feel the controlled power and authority radiating from him. The rest of the staff scrambled. The floor manager, usually a loud and boastful man, suddenly found a reason to disappear into the kitchen. The other waitresses whispered behind their hands, eyes wide with a primal sort of fear. To them, Tae-hoon was a predator, a man whose name alone ended lives. But as Zuri watched him take a seat at a secluded corner table, she didn't see a monster. She saw a man who looks like he carries the weight of the world on his shoulders, his expression calm, but underscored by an intense, weary shadow. While the others hesitated, paralyzed by the reputation of the Korean Mafia boss, Zuri stepped forward. She didn't approach with the frantic, subservient energy he was likely used to. Instead, she walked with a quiet, steady grace. When she reached the table, she didn't bow or stammer. She simply set down a glass of water and a menu, meeting his dark, piercing eyes with a soft, genuine smile. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the sea of nervous whispers. "It's a miserable night out there. Can I start you with something warm, or would you prefer to settle in first?" The men flanking him tensed, surprised by her directness, but Tae-hoon raised a hand, silencing them without a word. He looked at Zuri, really looked at her, the way a person looks at a rare find in a pile of glass. For 5 years, Zuri had been a ghost in her own life, making herself small to avoid the ire of her manager. But in that moment, she allowed herself to be seen. She treated him not as a king or a killer, but as a guest. She noticed the slight dampness on his shoulder from the rain and silently brought over a fresh, dry linen napkin before he could even ask. Throughout the meal, she anticipated his needs with a dignity that stood in stark contrast to the terror of her peers. She didn't hover and she didn't tremble. When he finally rose to leave, the air in the lounge seemed to settle. He paused by the podium where she stood. Without a word, he pulled a simple, elegant business card from his pocket, black with gold lettering. "Most people in this city look at me and see only what they can lose," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "You looked at me and saw man. You held your head high when everyone else bowed theirs." He pushed the card toward her. "I owe you a debt of honor, Zuri Coleman. If the world ever tries to make you small, call me. I will be your backup." At the time, she had tucked the card into her uniform, thinking she would never need the protection of a dragon. She didn't realize then that his certainty was absolute, or that 6 months later it would be the only thing keeping her alive. The cold air in the narrow service hallway bit at Zuri's skin, but it was the sound of the manager's footsteps that truly froze her blood. Each heavy thud on the linoleum sounded like a countdown. She pressed her back against the damp brick wall, clutching her phone to her chest as if it were a shield. Her arm throbbed where he had grabbed her, and the copper taste of blood from her split lip was a bitter reminder of the slap that had finally broken her spirit. "Zuri, I know you're back here," the manager, Mr. Henderson, bellowed. His voice was thick with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no by someone he considered beneath him. You think you can just run away? You owe this lounge 10 more hours. Get out here before I make that bruise match the other side of your face." Zuri squeezed her eyes shut, her thumb hovering over the call button. She thought of the black and gold card. She thought of the man who looked at her like she was a person. "I will be your backup." With a trembling breath, she pressed it. The ringing lasted only a second. "Yes," a voice answered, deep, calm, and terrifyingly steady. "It's Zuri," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The lounge, the back hallway. He's hurting me." "I am 3 minutes away," Taehyun replied. There was no hesitation, no questions. "Stay on the line. Do not hang up." Henderson rounded the corner, his face flushed with rage. He saw the phone and let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Who are you calling? The police? By the time they get through the front door, I'll have taught you exactly what happens to girls who don't know their place." He lunged forward, his hand snapping out to grab her hair. Suddenly, the heavy steel fire door at the end of the hallway didn't just open, it exploded inward. The sound was like a thunderclap in the cramped space. 4 men in charcoal suits stepped through with the synchronized precision of a strike team, but it was the man who walked behind them who stopped Henderson in his tracks. Lee Tae-yun moved with a controlled power that seemed to darken the very lights in the ceiling. He didn't run, he didn't shout, he simply walked until he was 5 feet away, his intense gaze fixed on Henderson's hand, which was still inches from Zuri's face. Henderson's bravado vanished instantly. His face went from a heated red to a thickly pale gray. He was a small-time bully who thrived on the fear of waitresses, but he wasn't stupid. He recognized the tailored overcoat, the diamond-sharp eyes, and the sheer lethality of the man standing before him. "Mr. Lee," Henderson stammered, his voice jumping an entire octave. His hand dropped to his side as if it had been burned. I didn't know she was... I was just disciplining a staff member for..." "You touched her," Tae-yun said. The words were quiet, almost a whisper, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. He stepped past the manager as if he were nothing more than a piece of trash in the road, reaching out to Zuri. Zuri didn't shrink away. As his large, warm hand settled gently on her shoulder, the suffocating urgency of the last hour finally began to lift. "Look at me, Zuri," Tae-yun commanded softly. When she met his eyes, she saw a promise of absolute protection. He then turned his head slightly toward Henderson, his expression shifting into something icy and final. "You have 30 seconds to realize that your life as you knew it ended the moment you laid a finger on her." The transition from the grimy, neon-lit service hallway to the interior of Lee Tae-yun's obsidian SUV felt like crossing into another dimension. The vehicle was a silent vault, moving through the city streets with a predatory grace that ignored traffic and red lights alike. Zuri sat in the back, her small frame swallowed by the hand-stitched leather seat, while Tae-yun remained a silent, looming presence beside her. He didn't hover, but the heat radiating from him was the first thing that had made her feel warm in years. When the car finally slowed, it wasn't at a police station or a hospital, but at the foot of a sprawling estate tucked away in the hills, hidden behind layers of wrought iron and stone. As the gates hissed open, Zuri pressed her forehead against the cool glass. This was the Dragon Sanctuary, a fortress of glass and steel that seemed to grow out of the cliffside. Armed men stood at regular intervals along the perimeter, their expressions as unreadable as the stone walls they guarded, yet they all bowed in unison as the car passed. "You are safe here, Zuri," Tae-yun said, his voice cutting through the hum of the climate control. "My home is a place where the world's noise cannot reach." As the doors were opened for her, Zuri stepped out into a courtyard illuminated by soft, recessed lighting that made the koi ponds shimmer like liquid silver. The air here smelled of pine and expensive incense, a far cry from the stale grease and cheap floor cleaner of the lounge. As she walked through the massive front pivot door, her breath caught. The foyer was a cathedral of marble with a grand staircase that swept upward like a frozen wave. The wealth and security she encountered was not just in the gold accents or the priceless ink paintings on the walls, it was in the absolute stillness. For the first time in 5 years, the constant vibrating tension in her shoulders began to fray. There was no one here to yell, no one to demand she work faster, and certainly no one who would dare to raise a hand. A woman in a crisp medical tunic was already waiting in the hall, flanked by 2 more silent guards. Taehyun stopped and turned to Zuri, his intense gaze softening just a fraction as he took in her bruised lip and the trembling of her hands. "This is Dr. Cho. She will tend to your injuries in the guest wing," he explained, his tone brooking no argument. "Everything you need, clothes, medicine, rest, is already provided. My staff is your staff. If you require anything at 3 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon, you only have to ask." Zuri looked up at the towering ceiling, then back at the man who had plucked her from the mouth of a wolf. She felt like a ghost finally gaining substance, standing in a palace built of shadows and silver. She realized then that this wasn't just a place to hide, it was a place designed to remind her that she was worth protecting. As she followed the doctor toward the wing that would be hers, she looked back over her shoulder one last time. Taehyun was still standing in the center of the marble foyer, a dark, immovable pillar of strength, watching her until she disappeared from sight. The guest suite was a masterclass in understated elegance, draped in soft charcoal silks and warm wood, but to Zuri, its greatest luxury was the heavy reinforced door. After Dr. Cho had finished setting her arm and cleaning the bluing of blood from her face, Zuri had been left alone in a silence so profound it felt heavy. She stood in the center of the room for a long time, her good hand resting on the foot of the bed, waiting for the familiar sound of a raised voice or a heavy, aggressive footstep. It never came. Instead, when she peered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she saw the silhouette of a guard standing motionless at the end of the stone terrace. Beyond that, she knew Taehyun was awake in his study, a man whose controlled power served as a silent, invisible dome over the entire estate. Zuri moved toward the bed, the linens smelling faintly of cedar and fresh air. For 5 years, sleep had been a dangerous necessity, something she did with one ear pressed to the door and her heart rate never truly dropping below a gallop. In the lounge's narrow hallways and her own cramped apartment, she had learned to sleep like a ghost, ready to vanish or defend herself at a moment's notice. She climbed under the covers, expecting the darkness to bring the usual intrusive memories of the manager's sneer. But as she laid her head on the silk pillowcase, she realized the suffocating urgency that had defined her life was gone. She wasn't just behind a locked door, she was behind the most feared name in the city. The realization acted like a sedative. If the world tried to reach her tonight, it would have to go through Lee Tae-hyun first. For the first time since she was a child, Zuri felt the tension drain out of her jaw. Her breathing slowed, synchronizing with the rhythmic, distant hum of the estate's security systems. There was no need to stay awake to guard herself when a dragon was already standing watch. The sleep that claimed her wasn't the fitful, shallow rest of a victim. It was a dreamless sleep, a deep, restorative plunge into shadows that held no threats. She didn't dream of the slap, the cold hallway, or the taste of copper. She simply drifted in the absolute certainty of her own safety. In the heart of the dragon's sanctuary, surrounded by a wealth she never imagined, Zuri Coleman finally stopped being a ghost and began the long process of coming back to life. When the morning light eventually crept across the marble floors, she was still pinned in that perfect, heavy slumber, protected by a man who had turned his debt of honor into her fortress. When Zuri emerged from her suite the following afternoon, she found Tae-hyun in a glass-walled study that overlooked the mist-shrouded valley. He wasn't dressed in the imposing overcoat from the night before, but in a charcoal-colored sweater that made him look slightly more approachable, though no less lethal. On the sprawling mahogany desk before him lay a thick manila folder and a digital tablet glowing with columns of red and green data. He looked up as she entered, his intense gaze sweeping over her face to check the swelling of her lip. "You look as though you finally rested," he said, gesturing for her to sit in the velvet armchair opposite him. Zuri sat, her splinted arm resting carefully in her lap. "I didn't think I could sleep like that anymore," she admitted, her voice gaining a strength it hadn't possessed in years. She looked at the documents on his desk. "Is that about the lounge?" Taehyun slid the folder toward her. "I told you 6 months ago that I would be your backup, Zuri. A dragon does not simply scare away a threat, he incinerates the ground it stood on." He tapped the tablet. "This is the Ledger of Sins." "Your manager, Mr. Henderson, was a small man with a very large appetite for greed. While he was busy making you feel small, he was busy making himself rich at the expense of his employers and the girls who worked for him." As Zuri flipped through the pages, her eyes widened. It wasn't just a record of his violence, it was a systematic map of his corruption. Taehyun had been tracking Henderson long before the call. There were bank statements showing embezzled funds from the lounge's liquor inventory, receipts for under-the-table kickbacks from shady suppliers, and, most chillingly, a list of previous waitresses who had been intimidated into silence after similar disciplinary incidents. "You knew?" Zuri whispered, looking up at him. "I knew he was a rot in that establishment," Taehyun replied, his expression as cold as a winter morning. "I had my people gather this as part of a routine cleanup of the district's businesses. I was waiting for the right moment to excise the tumor. I only regret that I waited long enough for him to touch you." Zuri realized then that Taehyun's protection wasn't just a reactive impulse, it was a calculated, overwhelming force. The folder contained enough evidence to send Henderson to prison for a decade, but in Taehyun's world, the Ledger of Sins was more than just evidence, it was leverage. "He thought he was invisible because he was powerful compared to us," Zuri said, her fingers tracing the edge of a document that detailed a theft Henderson had blamed on her months ago. "The loudest men are often the easiest to track," Taehyun said, standing up and walking to the window. "He built his life on your silence and your fear. Now those same sins will be used to dismantle everything he owns. He doesn't know it yet, but he is already a ghost. I just wanted you to see the paper trail of his ending before I close the book." The suffocating urgency of the previous night was replaced by a cold, sharp sense of justice. Seeing the numbers and the facts laid out so clearly made Zuri realize that her abuser wasn't a monster, he was just a common thief who had mistaken her kindness for weakness. Under Taehyun's watchful eye, the Ledger of Sins was the first step in Zuri reclaiming the narrative of her own life. The following evening, Taehyun led Zuri to a room she hadn't yet seen. It was a sleek, dimly lit command center within the estate, dominated by a wall of high-definition monitors. He pulled out a chair for her, his touch on her shoulder a grounding presence as he gestured toward the central screen. The ledger was the preparation. This is the conclusion. On the screen, Zuri saw a room she recognized, the private office at the back of the lounge. Henderson was sitting at his desk, his foot tapping a frantic, jagged rhythm. He looked haggard, his shirt rumpled, and his eyes darted toward the door every time a shadow passed. He was a man waiting for a blow he knew was coming but couldn't see. The door to the on-screen office swung open. It wasn't the police who entered, but two of Taehyun's most composed associates carrying a slim leather briefcase. They didn't shout or display weapons. Their controlled power was far more terrifying. Henderson scrambled to his feet, his mouth moving in what looked like a desperate greeting, but the men simply placed a single sheet of paper on his desk. Zuri watched as Henderson read. Even through the digital feed, the shift in his posture was visceral. The arrogance that had defined him, the straight spine of a bully, collapsed. His knees hit the chair with a heavy thud. "What are they showing him?" Zori whispered. The total sum of his life, Tae-yoon replied, leaning against the console beside her. They are showing him the wire transfers to his secret accounts, the signed statements from the vendors he blackmailed, and the direct evidence of the assault in the hallway. We have already sent copies to the lounge's ownership and the district attorney. He is being offered a single choice: sign the confession and the resignation, leave the city tonight with nothing but the clothes on his back, or wait for the police to arrive and spend the next 15 years in a cell where my name is the only law. On the monitor, Henderson looked like a trapped animal. He picked up a pen, his hand shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. He looked toward the camera, toward the hidden lens, as if he could feel Tae-yoon's icy gaze on the other side. With a defeated slouch, he scribbled his name across the bottom of the documents. Zori felt a strange, light sensation in her chest. For years, she had imagined this moment would involve screaming or violence, but seeing him reduced to a trembling, insignificant man by the mere weight of his own crimes was far more powerful. He wasn't a monster, he was a coward who had been stripped of his shadow. The associates took the papers, snapped the briefcase shut, and walked out, leaving Henderson alone in the dark office. He buried his face in his hands, a broken figure who had finally realized he had no moves left. Tae-yoon reached over and switched off the monitor, plunging the glass room into soft ambient light. He turned to Zuri, his expression solemn. He is gone, Zuri. He will never step foot in this district again, and he will never utter your name. The silence he used to cage you is now his own. Zuri let out a long, shuddering breath she felt she had been holding for 6 months. The suffocating urgency was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity. She wasn't just safe, she was avenged. As she looked at Tae-yoon, she realized that while he had been the sword, the victory belonged to her. She had made the call, and in doing so, she had authored the end of her own nightmare. The morning after the confrontation in the glass room, the heavy, oppressive weight of the past 5 years seemed to evaporate with the sunrise. Zuri stood in the center of her guest suite, staring at the small pile of fabric on the marble floor. It was her maid uniform, the thin, synthetic fabric of the black dress and the starched white apron she had been forced to wear at the lounge. To anyone else, it was just a work outfit, but to Zuri, it was the skin of a ghost. It was the costume of someone who was paid to be invisible, to take hits, and to never speak back. With a steady hand, she gathered the uniform. She didn't fold it. She didn't treat it with the care she once had to, fearing Henderson's wrath over a single wrinkle. Instead, she walked to the small terrace and dropped it into a waste bin, a silent rejection of the inherited silence that had nearly cost her her life. Tae-yoon had arranged for several racks of clothes to be brought to the suite, not the gaudy, revealing things the lounge owners favored, but soft cashmeres, tailored trousers, and silk blouses in deep, grounded tones of forest green and slate. For the first time, Zuri chose a dress because of how the fabric felt against her skin, not because of how well it would allow her to blend into the shadows. She caught her reflection in the full-length mirror. The swelling in her lip had receded to a faint purple memi. Her hair was brushed back, revealing the sharp line of her jaw and the clarity in her eyes that had been missing for half a decade. She wasn't a young waitress in a maid uniform anymore. She was a woman who had survived a war and come out the other side with her soul intact. As she fastened a simple silver necklace, she felt the shift in her own controlled power. It wasn't the loud, aggressive power of a bully like Henderson or the overwhelming, lethal authority of Tae-yoon. It was the power of someone who had reclaimed their own image. She was no longer a victim waiting for the next blow. She was a survivor standing on her own 2 feet. When she finally walked down the grand marble staircase to meet Tae-yoon for breakfast, she didn't keep her eyes on her shoes. She held her head high, the soft rustle of her new silk dress, a quiet anthem of her independence. Taehyun was waiting at the foot of the stairs, his expression unreadable as always, but as his eyes traveled over her, he dipped his head in a gesture of profound respect. "The uniform was a cage, Zuri," he said softly, his voice echoing in the vast foyer. "Today, I see only the woman who was brave enough to break out of it." Zuri offered him a smile, not the customer service mask she had worn at the lounge, but a real, radiant expression of self. She realized then that shedding the uniform was just the beginning. She was no longer apologizing for taking up space in his world or her own. The reclaiming of her image was complete, and for the first time in her life, she was looking forward to the person she was becoming. The morning air was crisp as Zuri stood on the balcony of the estate, looking out over the sprawling city that had once felt like a labyrinth of traps. For weeks, the sanctuary of Lee Taeyeon's home had been her cocoon. She had been healed by the silence, protected by the guards, and nourished by the presence of a man who asked for nothing in return. But as her arm grew stronger and the nightmares faded into a dull hum, a new feeling began to stir beneath her ribs, a restless, quiet hunger for her own life. She found Taeyeon in the library, the morning sun casting long golden bars across the floor. He was reading, a figure of controlled power, even in repose. When she entered, he looked up, his dark eyes instantly searching her face for any sign of distress. "I found a place," Zuri said, her voice steady and clear. "A small apartment near the park. It's quiet and it has windows that catch the light in the afternoon." Taeyeon's expression didn't shift, but the air in the room seemed to grow heavy. He closed his book slowly. "You are safe here, Zuri. My resources are yours. There is no need for you to go back to a world that was so unkind to you." Zuri stepped further into the room, her head held high. The inherited silence of her past was gone, replaced by a resolve that felt like iron. "This world isn't unkind because I'm in it, Taeyeon. It was unkind because I was small, but I'm not a ghost anymore." She paused, meeting his intense gaze. "If I stay here forever, I'm just moving from one cage to a much larger, more beautiful one. I need to know I can walk down a street and unlock my own door. I need to own my own key." The silence stretched between them, thick with the unsaid. To anyone else, Taeyeon was a man of terror, a dragon who hoarded what he protected. But he looked at Zuri and saw the transformation he had helped ignite. He saw the woman who had shed the maid uniform and the fear, and he realized that to keep her there would be to undo the very strength he admired. "You want to prove you can survive without the shadow of a dragon," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "I want to know I'm surviving because I chose to," she corrected softly. "I'm not running away from you. I'm running toward myself." Taeyeon stood, walking toward her until he was close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound case. "I will not stop you, but you will take this. It is a security system tied directly to my personal line. It doesn't mean you aren't independent. It means you are smart enough to have an ally." Zuri took the case, her fingers brushing his. The suffocating urgency of her old life had been replaced by a crystalline independence, choice, and power. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me for what you've earned," he replied. As she walked out of the library to pack her few belongings, Zuri felt a lightness that had nothing to do with wealth. She was leaving the sanctuary, but she wasn't leaving her strength behind. She was heading toward a door that belonged only to her, ready to start a life where she was the one holding the key. The streetlights outside Zuri's new apartment hummed with a quiet, steady energy that matched her own. Her new home wasn't a sprawling estate or a marble fortress. It was a modest third-floor walk-up with creaky wooden floors and a small kitchen that smelled of the jasmine tea she had just brewed. It was a space defined by her own choices, from the thrifted armchair in the corner to the way the sunlight hit the succulents on the windowsill. When the buzzer rang, Zuri didn't jump. She didn't feel the old familiar tightening in her chest. She simply pressed the button to let him in. Lee Tae-hyun looked out of place in the narrow, dimly lit stairwell. In his perfectly tailored suit, he was a creature of high-walled sanctuaries and dark-tinted glass, yet as he stepped into her living room, he moved with a newfound hesitancy. He didn't loom over the space, he waited by the door, his controlled power held in check by a visible, quiet respect for the threshold he had just crossed. "It's small," Zuri said, handing him a ceramic mug, "but every inch of it belongs to me." Tae-hyun took the tea, his eyes scanning the room, landing on the bookshelf and the lack of shadows in the corners. "It is a place of peace," he noted, his voice a low rumble that felt grounded rather than threatening. "You've done well, Zuri." They sat across from each other at a small wooden table she had sanded down herself. The suffocating urgency of their first meeting was long gone, replaced by a thick, meaningful stillness. Zuri leaned forward, her hands steady on the table. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the bridge between her past and whatever future lay ahead. "I'm grateful for the dragon that saved me," she began, her voice unwavering. "But I won't be a treasure kept in a cave. If we are to have anything between us, Tae-hyun, it has to be on equal footing. I am not a debt to be collected, and I am not a victim to be managed." Tae-hyun set his mug down, his intense gaze meeting hers. For the first time, the man whose name alone ended lies looked vulnerable. He didn't reach for her hand or offer a platitude. He simply listened. "I need you to understand that my independence isn't a rejection of you, it's a requirement for me. I need a partner who knocks before he enters, who asks instead of commands, and who sees me as his equal, even if I don't have a fleet of cars or a ledger of sins." The silence that followed was different from the silence of the estate. It wasn't a silence of security, but one of understanding. Tae-hyun nodded slowly, a small, genuine shift appearing in the set of his shoulders. "I have spent my life making the world bow to my will," he admitted quietly. "But you are the only one who ever looked at me and asked for nothing but respect. I do not want a ghost, Zuri. I want the woman who had the courage to call me from that hallway." He reached across the table, not to take her hand, but to offer his own, palm up, a silent invitation rather than a claim. Zuri placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth and the strength, but also the restraint. They were no longer a savior and a victim. They were two people setting the ground rules for a life built on choice. In the quiet of her own apartment, Zuri realized that by demanding equality, she had finally found the one thing a dragon could never take: her own power. 1 year had passed since the night the hallway was cold and the world was small. Zuri stood at the front of a brightly lit community room, her reflection in the window showing a woman she barely recognized, not because of the absence of bruises, but because of the presence of light. Gone was the hunched posture and the eyes wide with fear. In their place stood a leader with a steady gaze and a voice that no longer trembled when she spoke of the past. The room was filled with women who sat exactly how she once had, shoulders pulled inward, gazes fixed on the floor, waitresses and workers who had been told their silence was their only currency. Zuri leaned against the podium, her silk sleeves rolled up to reveal the faint silver line of an old scar on her arm, a badge of survival rather than a mark of shame. "Toxicity thrives in silence," she told them, her voice echoing with independence, choice, and power. "I spent 5 years as a ghost because I thought my voice wasn't loud enough to reach the ears of justice. but the moment I stopped apologizing for existing was the moment I finally became free. When the meeting ended, Zuri didn't retreat into the shadows. She stayed to shake every hand, offering the same dignity she had once shown a stranger in a restaurant. As the last woman left, Zuri grabbed her keys and stepped out into the evening air. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Taeyun. "I am outside. Shall I walk you to the car, or are you leading the way tonight?" She smiled, a genuine expression of a woman who was loved but not owned. "I'm leading," she typed back. "I'll meet you at the restaurant." She walked to her own car, purchased with her own earnings from the advocacy center she now managed. As she drove through the city, she passed the high-end lounge where she had once bled in a dark hallway. It looked smaller now, insignificant against the backdrop of the life she had built. She realized that while Lee Tai-hen had been the catalyst, the transformation was hers. He had provided the sanctuary, but she had provided the courage. Arriving at the restaurant, she saw him waiting. He was still the middle-aged, well-dressed, composed man of authority, but the way he looked at her had changed. He no longer looked at a debt to be paid or a victim to be shielded. He looked at his equal. When she reached him, she didn't bow. She held her head high, meeting his intense gaze with a smile that spoke of a year of victories. "You're late," he said, though his tone was fond, devoid of the controlled power he used with the rest of the world. "I had people to help," she replied, sliding into the seat opposite him. "They needed to know that help exists, that they deserve better, and that leaving is possible." Zuri Coleman was no longer a ghost. She was a woman who had survived the fire and decided to become the flame. As they sat together under the warm glow of the restaurant lights, she knew the hardest lesson was over. She had stopped being the girl in the hallway and had become the woman who lived the life she deserved. Her head was high, her voice was loud, and for the first time in her life, the future was entirely hers to write. Zuri's journey is one voice, but it represents so many others still living in silence. If this story resonated, subscribe and turn on notifications to help amplify stories that deserve to be heard. Leave a comment about what spoke to you. Your words may reach someone who feels alone. By sharing this video, you help remind others that leaving is possible, help exists, and they deserve better. This is more than a story, it's a movement.